In the third part of this exploration of understanding, I want to look at approximate thinking. Approximate thinking is an amazing and very powerful tool, very powerful mental model. It is a phenomenon that affects, influences our thinking, our identity, and all the work that we do. It is very closely related to self-awareness. And as I say in Fuzzy on the Dark Side, it can be a source of creativity, understanding, but it can also be a dark and small prison. So in this discussion, I would like to go over how approximate thinking defines our knowledge, defines different knowledge fields, how it affects understanding, our understanding of beauty and of ourselves, and how it continuously defines our work. Understanding approximate thinking is a great starting point to understanding how we approach knowledge in general and how we can integrate all our knowledge. Starting from the points we discussed before on uncertainty and incompleteness, we reach approximate thinking because we said that uncertainty is built into the fabric of the universe. Uncertainty is fundamental. It is everywhere. It is not just what we think. And incompleteness is the destiny of all our knowledge. Approximate thinking is how we deal with the knowledge realm under these conditions of incompleteness and uncertainty. It is how we navigate the uncertainty and the incompleteness. And approximate thinking, actually, as a concept, we can see it in very old ideas, starting from Plato's ideas about the forms. And you probably have heard of the story of the cave and the shadows that appear on the walls of the cave. These are reflections of eternal truths. But what are they? They are approximations, in a sense. So what are these approximations? In the most simple form, an approximation is when we replace one object with another. So we say B instead of A. In reality, when we say B instead of A, we are replacing A, which is the actual thing, with something else, B, which is more convenient for us, easier to understand. And we do this in our processes of thinking, understanding, in our processes of communications. I say one thing, you understand something else. In our actions as well, I do one thing, but I am trying to achieve a certain objective and it doesn't work, so it's an approximate replacement of that. It is everywhere. But in terms of thinking in particular, we can think of B being a useful, convenient replacement of A. But in reality, there is a difference between B and A, and that is E, the error. So B is not exactly A. There is an error, E, involved in this equation. And this idea of the error, looking at the error, trying to understand the error, what is the difference between this useful B and this truthful A? Trying to understand the error, being mindful of the error, aware of the error. And this error is the assumption, this error is the unattainable, this error is the undoable. Understanding the error, keeping the error in mind can mean all the difference in our knowledge, in our awareness, and in our creativeness. So, approximate thinking is a cognitive tool, is a knowledge tool among many other cognitive tools. But approximate thinking is one of the most important cognitive tools because it is comprehensive, it links to all the others, and it is a great starting point for understanding how these work. And I will talk about that in the next section. How does approximate thinking combine and detail all these other knowledge tools? Think about it. Approximate thinking is related to ideas of pattern recognition, abstraction, analogies, and many other mental and cognitive tools and models. In the previous section, I introduced approximate thinking, and I said that it could be a great tool for understanding how we approach knowledge, for understanding how we think about the world, for understanding how our mental models work. And I said that approximations can be summarized by the equation B equals A plus E, where we replace the truth or the correct solution or the full picture with some sort of approximation, with something that is convenient. But in that replacement, there is always an error, an E. And the question here is, in science, for example, in the knowledge field, what is this E? What is the error? Well, it should be, typically, ideally, it should be a clear assumption. I make an assumption, I know my assumption, and so this assumption should be evident to me. Unfortunately, it frequently isn't. So I want to look at that in this section. First, how does science work? How does knowledge advance? Basically, scientists have simplified representations of reality all the time. This is how science works. In order for me to advance a certain hypothesis, a certain understanding, I need to look by using a certain lens. So these are convenient approximations because the world is very complex. I cannot look at all the variables. So I start removing variables by focusing my attention on a limited set of variables. Okay, so we have a limited perspective in order to focus, in order to gain an understanding of something, and then we sort of make an inductive jump. We look at data, we look at a set of observations, and we say, I think I see a pattern there. And this reflects a number of cognitive tools that we have. It is important to mention that intuition plays a great role here. So these great scientists, as we saw in some of the previous episodes, like Einstein, like Ramanujan, sometimes they can see truths that they're not very confident of yet. Actually, at times I feel certain I am right without knowing the reason. Imagination encircles the world. And we also saw a similar thing with Ramanujan. Sometimes he would see these equations and then he would go into the details. And sometimes they would be wrong. He would rectify them. So some of the mental cognitive operations or tools that I believe approximate thinking reflects elegantly. And these tools are always being used. Look at these. Abstraction. We always remove certain details in order to understand the big picture. We try to compress information. This is an image of approximation. Comparison or analogical thinking. When we compare two items together, what are we saying? Well, essentially we are saying, let's remove some details and see part of the picture that connects both. And this in turn takes us to pattern recognition. This is what a pattern recognition thinking is. You are approximating away, which is E, the error, certain details to see a certain part of the picture, right? Causal reasoning, synthesis, building a whole out of the parts. Again, implies this idea of induction, this idea of imagining a still incomplete picture, bringing it into reality. There are a number of interesting applications of this. I don't know if you've heard about it, but in physics, sometimes there is this joke about the spherical cow. What is the spherical cow? So in order to solve a problem, sometimes you have to assume that the cow is a sphere, because a sphere is easier to think about, is easier to model as equations. And this takes us to the idea of all models are wrong, but some are useful. And this is what we're doing in approximate thinking. Supposedly, we understand that the models we are using are not entirely accurate. They are useful for solving a certain problem. Another form of these approximate ideas is what is known as the Fermi estimates or the Fermi equations, based on the scientist Enrico Fermi. And these estimates are used in order to try to reach an answer that is good enough, that is convenient, within an order of magnitude of the correct answer. So think about this. If I tell you, what is the mass of the cars in a certain city? How do you calculate that? If I tell you, what is the number of intelligent civilizations out there in the universe? How could you calculate that? And this has become the source for a great discussion in astronomy. Even on the individual levels, we similarly make decisions based on approximate understanding? Are we rational beings? Do we make our decisions based on full understanding? Completely. The answer is completely no. We use heuristics. We use incomplete images. We use approximate understanding to reach a solution quickly. This is the topic of much research in decision theory. We make decisions based on approximate information. Sometimes we make our decisions based on no information. And this has led to the study of biases and heuristics. Now, I mentioned in the beginning that B equals A plus E. And in science, the E should be a clear assumption, but sometimes it isn't. And I would like to add this point, which I called in Fuzzy on the Dark Side, I called it the fuzzy truth of science. So even scientists miss the E sometimes. They don't make their assumptions clear. And the ideas of uncertainty and incompleteness that we discussed before are very relevant here. And this links us to Kuhn's idea of this paradigm. Scientists see the world from within a paradigm, from within a limited perspective. And this limited perspective approximates their whole view. And sometimes they get stuck in this paradigm for a variety of reasons. Why would you want to be stuck in an approximate view of reality? This is something I'll let you grapple with. But next we will talk about identities and beauty and approximate thinking. So we can take this idea of approximate thinking, of approximations, a little bit further and apply it to the fields of beauty, of art, but by going back to the initial question, B equals A plus E. Where does this E come from? Again, as we saw in the previous section, in science, it is supposed to come from conscious assumptions that we are making, clear assumptions. But the E, the error, can sometimes come from our own identity, from our own subjectivity. So the way in which we understand the world, the way in which we approximate the world, the way in which we fill the missing gap, the gap of uncertainty and incompleteness, is based on our own identity expressing itself in situations where sometimes it might be unclear to us that this is actually our identity expressing itself. We can see this in art. For example, I was looking at this painting by Monet. It's called Impression Sunrise. And if you look at this painting, it is obviously very approximate. There are not so many details in there. The harbor is not clear. The sky is not clear. What is happening here? So it looks very beautiful, and it is a great reflection of Impressionism, of this movement in which the details are not as important as conveying a general impression, a general emotional tendency. This is just one example. The same happens in other movements in art like abstractionism, where we have these shapes that are supposed to be general. They are supposed to have removed many details to reflect higher truths. And in a sense, the observer reflects or fills in the gap by their own identity. Cubism is another example where we have these different surfaces that reflect a small part of detail. And in all of these movements, there is a rejection of precision, a rejection of precise copying or precise representation, because the precision of copying, like this meticulous old art, is no longer considered great art because it is more readily available, more easily available to us. And this takes us to the next idea here, which is beauty itself is always almost there. In a sense, beauty is eternally approximate. You cannot truly grasp it. It is always out there, a little bit out there, beyond direct and full understanding. Because, well, if you caught it, would it still be beauty? There is always this concept of something incomplete, something you are longing to. And there's a very nice statement from the book of Tao here. The name that can be said is not the eternal name. Picasso said, I paint objects as I think them, not as I see them. Well, how does he think them? These are not exact representations. One other point here is reflected by our sense of comfort with this uncertainty. And John Keats actually says that what he calls the negative capability. And the negative capability is the ability to remain under uncertainty or in mysterious situations or in doubtful situations without any irritable reaching for fact and reason. So this idea of beauty sometimes sits in our ability not to reach, not to keep reaching for fact and reason, which we anyway saw can be an illusion frequently. One final comment here is within stories, is approximation within stories. And here we can look at what Campbell talks about when he, in his book, The Hero of a Thousand Faces, or the idea of the monomyth. And the monomyth basically says that different stories, different myths in the world have a similar structure. They are approximately the same. And he even built a model for that. It has one structure. There are, I read a book a while back about the structure of successful films and how similar they are. And again, it links to this concept. And this takes us back to the discussion we had on Jung when he talked about the collective unconscious and these archetypes that are present everywhere in general representations that are localized in approximate ways with different cultures. Star Wars is a direct application of this concept. Lucas talks about this directly. He says that some of these ideas of the general myth of the archetypes were reflected in his work in Star Wars. And so basically, I want to summarize all this discussion on beauty, identities, and approximate thinking by looking at the error again. This error in this case will always be there. It will always be unknown in a sense, and part of it comes from our identities. After looking at approximations, approximate thinking in the knowledge domain, in their relationships to art, to identity, I want to look at it from the perspective of creativity and innovation, or creativeness in the language of the Atlas. So the original equation, B equals A plus E. What is E here? What is the error in the cases of creativeness, in the case of innovation? Well, the error E here is what we cannot do, what we shouldn't try to do. In creativeness, our efforts are a battle to find precision in all the chaos around us. And we use approximate thinking, we use approximations to manage that. Let's look at design thinking and user experiences, for example. In design thinking, the recommendation is to work with approximate outputs, with an approximate understanding in order to create a product, an MVP or a prototype, a minimum viable product, as soon as possible. And there is this idea of let it be dirty, let's fail often because we don't know enough. So we acknowledge this E, we don't know enough. So we are trying to get feedback. We're trying to get help on the answer to this question. There is a divergent nature of exploration. And so these rough and dirty prototypes, these approximate prototypes, are very important to creativity and to innovation. And they are present everywhere. As long as it does a certain task specifically, then let's use it. As long as it can be used, let's use it. There are many interesting examples and recommendations from the practices of IDEO and from the literature on design thinking in general about this idea of let's get it out there in the hands of the users so we can understand what's happening. And for it to be out there, it just has to be an approximate representation of what we are trying to do. We acknowledge the incompleteness in order to get feedback. Think about user interfaces and user experiences. These things always have templates. The shapes of icons on different websites in different mobile applications are kind of similar. The designs sometimes, the designs of websites, the designs of apps follow certain design patterns, certain trends over time. Why do they do that? Well, these create islands of familiarity amidst all of the uncertainty, amidst all of the newness. And these islands of familiarity help with managing all the approximations that are happening, the approximations in implementation, the approximations in understanding that the user is trying to build. They're trying to understand what is happening approximately. And so these familiar elements help with these approximate understandings. In general, the idea of approximations, of trying to reach conclusions, is very interestingly implemented in machine learning, in artificial intelligence. Think about how these things work, how these models are trained. So it is not deductive, it is not A, B, C, D, E reasoning. It is, well, let's try to find an answer first, and then we will see if this answer works. And here, the error E is at the center of the equation. The whole creative effort is an attempt to reduce this E, is an attempt to reduce the error. So we come up with the answer, and then we see if it works. And if you can look at some of the earlier models of how AI works, or track how it reaches, it builds certain images, you can see this process in real time. You can see the approximate representation appearing first, and where the error is still very high, and different variations appear. And then based on these different variations, we move further towards the correct answer. We can think of creativity and innovation themselves as, overall, they are approximate flows. A flow from one domain to the other. Information flows, communication flows, not just idea flows. Creativity and innovation are applications of certain ideas from one domain into another domain. An interesting and funny example here I was reading about a while back is Ford's assembly line, right? The Model T, that's a famous example in innovation where Ford was the first to build this assembly line for the car. Turns out, probably the idea, the inspiration for the assembly line was looking at meat packing facilities in Chicago, where workers had a disassembly line for cutting meat, and every worker had a specific, limited, precise task to do. And here, looking at this, the executives at Ford said, well, can we do that with cars? And this approximate idea was transferred from one domain into the other, because it can only be transferred as an approximate idea. Another interesting example here is the Steve Jobs distillation. So Steve Jobs would focus on having the product reflect one clear idea. And there is this duality here between approximate thinking and its inverse. Brands themselves are a balance between clarity and approximation. And by pushing for a focus on a very specific trait with the product, Steve Jobs was trying to create this clear view, this management of approximation, this control of the error. And he says innovation is saying no to 1,000 things. So the concept here in creativeness is we are trying to find precision by understanding approximation. We are trying to balance the incompleteness, the uncertainty, the approximation of understanding with a method to find our way in the world. To conclude this discussion on approximate thinking, we have to look at the group, this last source of the E, the error, in B equals A plus E. Well, there is this cultural E. The E, the error that comes from the group, that comes from systems, that come from inertia, from things we have been doing in the past. And these are all things that we inherit. We just get these things, we assume they are the reality. We don't look deeply into them. And this cultural E is deeply integrated into language, into our religions, into culture, into systems of work. They are all filled with approximations, and we inherit all these approximations in understanding, in communications, in work. They are individual, but also collective and large scale. They all attempt to solve this problem of there is too much to know, there is too much to do, let's simplify it. Things are too complex, let's make them easier, let's make them more convenient. And these are done via collective contributions, so contributions from the group. This includes systems. We always do things like that. This is how we do things here. These are our values, right? And there is this glue of approximate thinking that connects us all together. It connects all our ideas. Because by hiding a certain degree of the truth, by keeping many assumptions implicit, it sort of enables cooperation and it enables cohesion in a sense. This is the cultural side of the E, the collective, the group side of the E. And there are very interesting examples of cultural flows. One culture taking an approximate representation of ideas from another culture and changing it. The travel of Buddhism to Japan and the birth of Zen Buddhism as an example. Right? Jokes themselves as cultural elements travel in approximate form sometimes. So I mentioned the spherical cow before. Well, when I was younger, I didn't know it was a spherical cow. Honestly, I had always assumed it was a spherical horse in the joke. So the joke is the same, spherical horse or spherical cow. I know, I find spherical horse a little bit funnier, but the general idea flows, the approximate idea flows, and it takes different shapes somehow. They are approximately, spherical cow and the spherical horse are approximately the same thing. Okay, so to summarize all this, there are two sides for this blade. There is the dark side and there is the bright side. There are two sides for approximation. But critically here, approximation is not sloppiness. It is strategy. We use it because it's useful, because it's practical. And so these two sides of the blade, the dark side and the bright side, are separated by one moment of awareness, by one moment of reflection. So in a sense, approximate thinking is a strategy, but it's also built into our nature because frequently we fill the gaps, we fill the error with our identities. And our identities can have multiple sources. Okay, so the difference between the bright side and the dark side is the difference between the creative potential, the ability to do great things, and the illusion of completeness. And here humility plays an important role. We always have to balance this great power of approximate thinking. It enables us to be like superheroes, to jump into the unknown, to assume that we know more than we are capable of. We always have to balance this power of approximate thinking by reflecting, by this moment of awareness. Ironically, we balance all this power of approximate thinking by looking at our own errors.